All good. All right. So, okay. So my name is Mason Hawthorne. I studied creative writing at the University of Wollongong, and my honours thesis was about the structural elements of characterization in the Hannibal Lecter novels, focusing on character doubling. This paper was first presented at the Feasting on Hannibal conference in 2016 and was later published in Horror Scholar's Hannibal edition. So my background's in creative writing, whereas I think like most of the presentations we've been having about the Gothic are more focused on literary criticism and like a little bit historical. So the content is going to be a little bit different to what we've been having previously, but hopefully still interesting to some people. So we just got a couple of terms before we get started. So transgender or trans describes a person who is assigned or assumed to be one gender at birth, but who identifies with another gender. Gender nonconforming is a person whose personal expression, personality, style, or etc. may not align with society's expectations for their gender. Gender nonconforming does not necessarily indicate a transgender identity. Butch is a queer masculine mode. Femme is a queer feminine mode, and cis or cisgender is an individual whose gender identity is not in conflict with their gender assumed at birth. So if there's anything throughout that's not clear, just save it to the end and you can ask, of course. Okay. So the Hannibal Lecter franchise has interested me since I first read them. The novels were full of characters with nuanced internal lives, personal conflicts with traditional gender roles and gender identities. And the marked difference between the diversity of the novels and the heteroconformity of the films makes for an interesting case study in looking at how the alteration of character identity can alter the meanings of the narratives around them. So being products of their time, the novels contain many ideas about queer identity that are now outdated, and there's room for improvement in the matter of representation. But in multiple adaptations of the franchise, the portrayal of transgender and gender non-conforming characters has largely had the effect of flattening or oversimplifying these characters, rather than expanding upon or improving their treatment. So here we're going to be looking at how Jame Gumb, Clarice Starling, Will Graham, and Margot Verger are treated in adaptation, and at the introduction of the character Randall and the impact that these choices have had on the meanings of the text. Okay. So Jame Gumb, or Buffalo Bill, as he's known, appears in The Silence of the Lambs, both book and film, as the main antagonist. James, a serial murderer who's motivated by the urge to transform himself into his mother by killing women and harvesting their skin to create a woman's suit. The narrative of the novel The Silence of the Lambs, excuse me, is driven by an internal conflict and struggle within Jame Gumb, and a sense of loss and lack which fuels his need to achieve transformation. The logic of James' metamorphosis stems from the early loss of his mother as the focal point of his conceptualization of love. Her death and his subsequent institutionalization, first as an orphan and later as a young offender, alienates him from normal interpersonal relationships and stunts his emotional development. In the novel, Benjamin Raspail describes Jame as not really gay, you know. It's just something he picked up in jail. He's not anything, really, just a sort of total lack that he wants to fill, and so angry. He always felt the room was a little emptier when he came in. And that lack is the heart of his character. Throughout the novel, James seeks a way to regain the love that was lost when his mother died, and violence is the only tool which he seems able to utilize in that pursuit. In order to retain Raspail's affection, Jame kills homeless men to entertain him, and when Raspail leaves him for another man, a sailor named Klaus, Jame kills Klaus and wears his skin in an attempt to become what Raspail desires. James' first attempt at transition is to male. Significantly, a death's head moth, the symbol of James' idealized transformation, is discovered in Klaus's severed head, linking this attempt to become a real man directly to his subsequent murders of women. Hannibal Lecter kills Raspail to break the cycle so that Jame will have to continue his career as a murderer pursuing his own fulfillment, rather than continuing to sublimate himself into the desires of others. In Jonathan Demme's 1991 film adaptation, The Silence of the Lambs, the locus of horror is shifted from the loss of identity through trauma to the transgender body. Jame is often shown wholly or mostly nude, working on his woman's suit, or tormenting his latest victims in the basement. And there's little to no attempt to elucidate his personal narrative or motivations. For the film audience, Jame is a caricature, a man trying to become a woman. The focus on the body turns it into a spectacle. The interior psychological focus of the novel is eluded, and instead, the physicality of the transgender body becomes the vehicle of horror. The lack of the character's interiority and the focus on the body also shifts the meaning of the story. Harris's characters, both villains and protagonists, are developed as vulnerable children who grow up to construct identities suited to survival against a system which is determined to crush non-normative elements. It's the conflict between the emotional needs of the interior child and the learned protective and reactionary responses of the adult that drives the character's personal arcs. And by stripping away this depth of character, the film also loses the significant portion of the novel which deals with personal trauma as a product of systemic violence. Instead, locating evil in the deviant choices of individuals and removing the context in which those choices are made. In the film, Jame becomes a facade with no substance, a simple grotesque parading the transgender body as a monstrosity, positioning the transgender individual as the devourer of the cisgender body, and the act of transition as a victimization of cisgender people. So Clarice Starling is possibly one of the best-known characters from the Hannibal franchise, aside from the titular Hannibal. She's a young FBI trainee who is recruited to interview Hannibal Lecter in an attempt to gain information that could help solve the latest series of murders that are occurring. While Clarice Starling doesn't pursue physical transition, she occupies a liminal gendered space in the story. She's a woman in a patriarchal society attempting to enter a male-dominated field and emulating an idealized version of her dead father. As someone who's hyper-competent, top of her class at Quantico, who has degrees in forensics and psychology, and is a champion markswoman, her skill, determination, and doggedness nonetheless become stumbling blocks, as her competence poses a threat to the patriarchal status quo. She's not a man, but is also stymied by an inability to pass as a proper woman. In the novels, many of the struggles that Starling faces are external. She's scrutinized by her superiors and by the media, and by the men she encounters, who become hostile when she cannot easily be relegated to the role of office girl or secretary. Of course, Starling grapples with the moral difficulties of her job and with her family history and difficult upbringing, but the main body of resistance she faces is external. The obstacles that she faces as she attempts to establish herself within a system and society that is structured to place her at a constant direct disadvantage. Similar to James' treatment, the films do little to acknowledge these systemic elements of Starling's narrative. Instead, the focus is on the physicality of the actresses, placing them visually at a disadvantage as smaller and weaker than the men around them, as trembling hands on a gun in the dark. By this sleight of hand, the films decentralize the struggle against the system and focus on the apparent limitations of a woman's body. The injustices that Starling faces, the betrayal and scapegoating that she's subject to both by the FBI and by wider society, is minimized in favor of positioning a woman's body as the primary disadvantage that she faces. Another significant element of the novel which is lost in the film adaptation is the extensive parallels between Starling and Jame. In biographical terms, both lose their parents at a young age, are sent to live with relatives with disastrous results, and are subsequently institutionalized until adulthood. The divergence occurs then. Starling has grown up with the idea that if she excels at everything she does, then she will be able to gain the approval of the institution, while Jame, in and out of prison, does whatever he can to seek the love and approval of whoever will take him. Both are seeking the love and acceptance that they were not given as children. Both will kill in this pursuit, and in the end, neither will find what they're searching for. The mirroring of these characters highlights a key question within the story. What's the nature of evil? In their first conversation, Lecter accuses Starling of having given up good and evil for behavioralism, offers Starling. You've got everyone in moral dignity pants. Nothing is ever anybody's fault. And at first glance, it might seem that this underlying thesis means that the narrative leads to condemning Jame for his actions and valorizing Starling for hers. But as Starling's personal arc continues into Hannibal, the question becomes more troubling. How many people is it acceptable for Starling to kill? How is it more good for Starling to kill in the name of an institution when we can see more and more as the story progresses that the institution itself is rotten? that it is funded and influenced by individuals with their own selfish, perverse agendas. The parallel here is between Starling's relationship to the institution, the FBI, which exploits her capacity to undertake violent action, with the promise of advancement forever dangled just out of her reach, and James' relationship to Benjamin Raspail, having to perform more extreme and perverse acts to maintain his interest in the hopes of one day perhaps being loved. In the film Hannibal, 2001, Starling remains behind when Lecter makes his final escape, returning to the institution which is ready to use her once more as a scapegoat for the failures of the system. Where the novels are driven through to a point of change as the characters' arcs progress, the films prioritize a return to the status quo and an acceptance of that good and evil are dictated by the state. Where the films begin by reducing Jame to a monstrous body and Starling's gendered and class struggles to the struggle of embodiment as a woman, they end by elating the role that institutions play in maintaining patriarchal hegemony. Okay. So Margot Verger is a butch lesbian bodybuilder and horse enthusiast and the younger sister of the novel Hannibal's main antagonist, Mason Verger. Mason Verger is a wealthy capitalist whose hobbies include torturing children and participating in genocide, and who was mutilated by Hannibal Lecter prior to Lecter's arrest and imprisonment, sort of before the events of any of the novels. So in the novel Hannibal, the character Margot Verger is introduced and plays a key role in the events of the plot. Through her, Hannibal Lecter and Mason Verger meet and come into conflict. Aside from her central role in the plot, Margot is a striking character for several reasons. She's a rare example of a butch lesbian in mainstream media portrayed sympathetically and as a developed and multifaceted individual. She has a wife and wishes to have her own family, though she is also still entangled with her abusive brother Mason. Margot's a bodybuilder. Within the Hannibal Lecter novels, bodybuilding is a recurring motif which is associated with adults dealing with childhood sexual abuse. Similarly to Frances Dolarhyde, Margot Verger takes up bodybuilding to become large and strong enough that she could not easily be victimized as she was as a child. The physical size and strength are a defense. She tells her brother, "You hurt me when I was little, Mason." Significantly, Margot links her victimization with size rather than age. She says, "when I was little," rather than "when I was a child" or "when I was young." Smallness becomes synonymous with weakness and vulnerability, and it means that by becoming large and strong, Margot and Frances both are able to do something tangible to combat their fear of further victimization. Physical strength does not preclude emotional or psychological abuse, and Mason Verger is capable of torturing Margot from his sickbed, using her desire for motherhood and family against her, and manipulating her to cooperate with him whilst keeping what she wants out of her reach. Despite her size and strength, she still falls victim to the repeating patterns of abuse in the family setting. So, in the film Hannibal, 2001, Margot Verger does not appear. So Margot Verger's entire absence from the film adaptation of Hannibal gives the film an unsettling quality. Now, rather than Hannibal Lecter and Mason Verger being in conflict over the abuse that Mason inflicted on Margot, now it seems that Lecter targets Verger due to his sexual advances, and this shifts the tone of the action from being a Southern Gothic style rumination on deeply buried family secrets being exposed to a homophobic frenzy where Lecter's bloodlust is justified as being in defense of his heterosexuality. Presenting Mason Verger as a villain without including the victims of his crimes, except for brief asides and suggestions, he loses a depth of horror that Harris built in him. His crimes become abstract and distant, and the main textual reasoning that we're given to dislike him, aside from his revenge hunt for the fan-favorite character, is his implicit queerness. His crime is wearing leather pants and attempting to seduce Lecter. In this film, Margot's absence distorts the shape of the story, and while the broad outline of the plot remains, the reasoning for events occurring becomes wildly different. Brian Fuller's adaptation, the TV series Hannibal, does include Margot Verger, but her personality, appearance, and gender presentation are markedly divergent from the source material. And this also contributes to some unfortunate implications within the text. Margot goes from butch to hard femme, from smart-mouthed Joel, and from large and muscular to slender. Fuller explained his reasoning behind the change in an AV Club magazine interview during the second season's runtime as, In the novel, she's a very masculine character who has had years of steroid abuse and is a lesbian, and it was unclear to me in the novel whether she was either transgender or a lesbian as a result of these horrible abuses and that horrible childhood. And that's not how transgenderism or homosexuality works. I didn't want to contribute to that misconception of what it is to be transgender or a gay woman. But in wanting to avoid perpetuating misconceptions, Fuller stumbles across a few of them himself. While in the novels the bodybuilding motif specifically connects to the history of childhood sexual trauma, Margot's gender nonconformity is not linked to her trauma. Rather, she expresses several masculine traits in ways which are in keeping with the established diversity of characterization of women within the novel series. While her body is strong and large, and while she does have a history of steroid use in pursuit of that physical ideal, Margot describes herself as a woman and is treated as such by other characters in the novel. Her masculine presentation prompts unease in some characters, but between Margot's own internal monologues and the observations of the characters closest to her, there's no question of her gender. When Fuller conflates womanhood and the expression of femininity, he narrows the spectrum of acceptable modes of womanhood in the world he creates on screen. And this links back to the issues encountered in the adaptation of Jame Gumb's character. The emphasis is placed on the gender non-conforming body rather than on the internal struggle. Because Margot of the novel doesn't fit the acceptable mold of a slim, pretty femme lesbian, she's misread as a transgender monstrosity, being rescued back into the bounds of an acceptable performance of femininity. And so while Margot as an adult, significantly altered, appears in the TV adaptation, her childhood and history with Hannibal Lecter are repurposed for use as the backstory for Randall, a character introduced in the season 2 of the NBC Hannibal series, for whom Fuller described as a terrible, terrible, inappropriate metaphor for the transgender experience. Tyr is a young man who has been seeing Hannibal Lecter since childhood to address his identity issues. Tyr believes that he is really a bear, and he is driven to physically transform himself through the use of a mechanical suit crafted with the teeth of a bear, and then to use that suit to murder people. The conversation between Margot and Lecter in the novel is lifted directly into episode 9 of the second season of Hannibal, recalling the first time that they met in his office and with the child revealing what is felt to be an awful secret. To say that the perceived ambiguity of Margot's gender identity and history of trauma is offensive, but then to take these problematic elements and use them to construct yet another monstrous transgender character shows at best a confusion about what it is to be transgender, and at worst a cynical ploy to exploit the language and experiences of a minority group for shock value. In a series which adapts a complex and difficult text into a lyrical and beautiful meditation on the themes that underpin the novels, this seems to be an uncharacteristically graceless fumble. Okay, so Will Graham is a retired FBI special agent working as a boat mechanic in Florida, where he lives with his new wife Molly and her son. He's the protagonist of the Red Dragon novel, Red Dragon film, the film Manhunter, and the NBC Hannibal TV series. Francis Dolarhyde is the antagonist of the novel Red Dragon and his subsequent adaptations. He's a serial killer who targets whole families to fuel his transformation into the Great Red Dragon, his conceptualization of his superior, superhuman self based on the William Blake painting of the same name. Jack Crawford is the head of the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit and is the person who brings Will Graham back into the FBI after his retirement. Jack Crawford also appears in The Silence of the Lambs as Clarice Starling's mentor and superior, and in the Hannibal novel and all adaptations of the series. So family is the focus of the crimes that set the events of the Red Dragon novel in motion. A serial killer nicknamed the Tooth Fairy by popular press, that's Francis Dolarhyde, the Red Dragon, ritualistically murders whole families. As the killer's spree continues, the head of the FBI Behavioral Science Unit, Jack Crawford, coaxes Will Graham out of retirement, away from his family, and back into the world of the criminally insane. Graham allows himself to be drawn away from his recently found family and some well-earned peace in order to prevent other families succumbing to the killer. In the process of the hunt, however, Graham's own family is destroyed and he is drawn into a violence that he has always feared himself capable of. The killer is stopped, but at what cost? Both Will Graham and Frances Dolarhyde are motivated by desires deeply rooted in the expectations of a patriarchal culture. Graham is compelled to abandon his family in order to prove his masculinity through the act of saving future victims from the killer at large. Dolarhyde is compelled to constantly reenact the abuse that he suffered and internalized as a child in order to become the Great Red Dragon. In Red Dragon, masculinity is not neutral. The masculinity of Graham and Dolarhyde is implicated in the systemic injustices which they perpetuate against themselves and the families that they come into contact with, and through which they themselves have been shaped. Toxic masculinity is constructed of those aspects of hegemonic masculinity that foster domination of others and are thus socially destructive. And while it's easy to see where such a definition applies to Dolarhyde's overtly destructive acts of murder and desecration, it is less easy to ascertain where Graham's moderate masculinity becomes toxic. This is partly because toxic masculinity is often rationalized in a culture that places masculine modes of understanding as central and therefore invisible. But it also because in novels of this kind, there is often a greater margin of error within which the male protagonist may operate. There is a sense of masculine behavior being excusable, whatever it might involve, as long as the protagonist saves the day, and as long as the protagonist saves the day, whatever wrongs he has done will be forgiven and he will be brought back into the fold. Graham is drawn back into the FBI not because he feels a great need to do good, but because he needs the approval that comes with saving people. In seeking approval, which is located in the masculine world of the FBI, he ultimately destroys the bonds of his own family, alienating his wife Molly and his stepson. Graham is reluctant to return to the work at first, resisting the call to a destructive masculinity, but he is swayed by Jack Crawford's suggestion that staying would impugn his masculinity and security. If you stay here and there's more killing, maybe it would sour this place for you. Graham enters the story then with his own family and home being ransomed to his success or failure. Graham also has a fatalistic and self-destructive streak that leads him to lash out at his wife when he's under pressure. He can't stop the ugliness of his professional life from contaminating the sanctity of what he holds dear in his personal life. At points, Graham also exhibits a strong need to dominate and control others, a readiness to resort to violence, particularly when he feels himself to be threatened or intimidated. As he interviews Niles Jacoby, the son of one of the murdered families, he is intimidated by Niles's rough trade ex-con homosexual partner, Randy, and establishes his dominance in the interaction by showing his credentials and threatening to shoot Randy if he disobeys. When that encounter is over, Graham knew he was angry at Randy because he had feared him. The pattern emerges at any point where his masculinity is threatened. Graham's fear or embarrassment is sublimated into violent anger, following a pattern that, though less outrageously enacted, is similar in function to Frances Dolarhyde's own murderous outbursts. So both Graham and Dolarhyde are driven by their internalization of toxic masculinity to sublimate whatever they feel threatens them into actions that are designed to rebuff that perceived threat. While Graham is able, at least on occasion, to acknowledge the source of his actions and to understand the emotions that drive them, his understanding is not significant enough to change his behavior. It is this need to avenge any slight to their masculinities that leads to both of their respective downfalls. Dolarhyde dies attempting to wipe out Graham's family in retribution for being stopped in his killing spree. Graham, incapable of providing the genuine respectful partnership that Molly needs from him, ends up a reclusive alcoholic. In contrast to the novel, where Will Graham's masculinity is a site of deep conflict, in the film adaptations this is eluded. The tragic and overtly violent elements of Graham's character are lost, and instead he comes across as a sad, brooding, but ultimately grounded man. More egregiously, rather than Graham's tragic slide into divorce and lonely alcoholism, the two film adaptations position him as a hero, vanquishing the dragon and literally sailing off into the sunset with his wife and kid, whom he saved by the righteous application of violence. Rather than the nuanced interrogation of the ways that institutionalized masculinity encourages men to act against their own interests, the films insist that a sanctioned expression of violence is good for the family and that it should invigorate the heroic masculine man. In the NBC Hannibal series, Will Graham's conflicted masculinity is central to the show. In an interview with the AV Club, Brian Fuller describes his aim in depicting Will Graham as being to give him a vulnerability that I think the character hadn't had before on screen. We've always seen him as a stoic leading man and highly competent at his job. And I thought if we take some of those elements we're seeing in his internal life and make them a little more external, then we have a new version of the character that is very honest to how he's portrayed in literature. In the TV series, the relationship between Will Graham and Jack Crawford is much closer to the dynamic within the novels. Despite being told at multiple points that Will Graham's health is declining directly as a result of the work he's doing, Jack Crawford persists in pressuring Will to participate in investigative work which compounds the trauma he experiences. The institutional element of toxic masculinity is translated onto the small screen. As within the novel, there are other options for Jack Crawford to utilize. He could consult with Dr. Bloom and leave Will Graham out of it. But rather than seeking in Will the best guy for the job, he's seeking the guy who'll do the job the way I want it done. It's not for Will's greater ability in the field that he is prized, it is for the ease with which his superiors can manipulate him to do things which they otherwise wouldn't be able to get away with. So, in adaptation, alterations of elements of characterization necessarily alters the meaning of the text. So when creators are working in adaptation have little or no familiarity with transgender issues or with the breadth of gender expression possible outside of the bounds of heteronormative and cisnormative social expectations, or when they are less interested in representing trans and gender non-conforming individuals with accuracy and compassion on screen, they can perpetuate damaging stereotypes and even introduce troubling meanings that weren't present in the original text. While the Hannibal Lecter novels are products of their time and contain many elements of characterization of transgender and gender non-conforming individuals that are outdated and damaging, they do have a depth of character psychology and drive which is seldom successfully replicated on screen, leading to often confusing and sometimes horrifying changes to the implicit meaning of the narratives. And that's about it. So
well, thank you so much. You looked very calm doing it, so well done, amazing. I don't know if you see you've already got a question, Mason. So if anyone else has questions, pop them in the chat. Or...
All right, so Alex has said, I like your take on Margot. Were any women in the TV show not extremely thin and femme? Yeah, no, that was one of my sort of main misgivings about the TV series was the lack of diversity among the female characters. Like each character individually, I really love. Like, they're all really interesting characters. They've all got strong personalities. They're all, active agents in the plot. But when you sort of line them all up and sort of think of them as, like how are these characters sort of individuals, you sort of get a very cookie cutter effect where it's like, yep, it's a thin white woman, it's a thin white woman, it's a thin white woman. There's one black woman, two black women, and that's kind of it. And obviously, I two Asian women, yeah, side characters, yeah. So, but it's kind of this pattern where it's like, I think Beverly Katz and what's her name, the trainee, the not Clarice Starling. Yeah, there's like two women who sort of wear, business casual, and it's a little bit like, oh, they're the most mask we're going to get in terms of the women, but they're still very, traditionally sort of pretty and stuff. So your presentation seems quite enmeshed in the text quad-text and clear love for Harris's original work. How do you square that with the context in which both novels and adaptations were made? For example, Harris's weak justification re Jame that real transsexuals are inherently passive, or Fuller's battle with the Hannibal writers' room not to keep Margot from being rewritten just as a femme lesbian as a heterosexual who would have been in a romance with Will. And Miriam last, sorry. Yeah, I think like in context, so we did kind of, I think I had a discussion with Sam the other day about the real transsexuals passage in the novel, and because it does come up in the movie. Yeah, I think that whilst that discussion happens, it's not really. I mean, like, in my experience, sort of in the medical system and stuff, like, what the official literature says about trans people doesn't necessarily mean anything. And I don't, yeah. So, like, I think that according to the medical standards of the time, Jame is not transsexual. But I don't think that, given the evidence on the page, that, you know, that we can read him as not trans in any sense. It's just that he's a type of trans that didn't exist at the time, and also, like, you know, separately a horrible murderer. I think there's some level of irony in the characterization of totally passive transsexuals as well. Like, it's kind of something in the novels where like, sometimes a generalization will be made, and you'll immediately see people behaving kind of counter to that generalization. But yeah, like, I mean, definitely, like, there's a lot of problems with the way that queer identities are represented in the novels as well, like, obviously. But I do think that it's sort of like Harris working with the textbook of, you know, what a real transsexual is. But then also in the novel itself, like, there's a big discussion very close to the discussion of real transsexuals about how the textbook can't always be relied on in real life. So I don't know, like, I'm sort of like ambivalent about that, because I'm not sure, sort of in my reading of the text, whether it's ironic. Like, you know, I don't think it's meant in an unironic sense, in a way. And about Fuller. Oh, okay. So I didn't mean not reading Jame as trans, but rather that he clearly is transcoded, but well within a long history of transcoded characters in media who are characterized as violent. The most obvious being Psycho. The passive comment struck me as Harris wanting to have his cake and eat it too. Well, I mean, so I did discuss this a little bit in the earlier session. A lot of Jame and even Francis's characterization is related to, so there's real life, unfortunately, real life examples that these characters were kind of based on. So the most obvious parallel is Ed Gein. Yeah, sorry, it's Ed Gein. So he's the guy whom Psycho was loosely based on, and there are a lot of clear parallels between Ed Gein and the novels. And I think with, like, the irony of the Ed Gein thing is that I don't think anyone really thinks he was a transsexual. And sort of the idea was that he was attempting to delude himself, or, like, you know, creating himself a situation where he could pretend that his mother hadn't died because he was extremely traumatized by that. So he stole her corpse and started dressing in her clothes to pretend that she was still in the house. And that's sort of directly done in Psycho, where, you know, they have a thing at the end where they're kind of like, oh, but he's not transsexual. He's got a delusion. And it's kind of like he used the sort of skin suit idea for Jame and the mother, you know, idealization. But then went, yeah, but what if this guy really was a transsexual but a violent one? So it's I think it is like kind of a little bit ironic in that there's like all of this official literature which says like, oh, transgender people are non-violent. Transgender people, if they have done any crimes, they're probably not transgender unless the crime was related directly to gender expression, like cross-dressing in public or something, like non-violent crimes. But that just means it's an easy way to cut people out of your criteria for diagnosis. Um, is Harris obliged to engage with flawed criminal and medical discourses of his time as a rule of his genre? And maybe there are limits to how truly critical he can be to the validity of the discourses in underpinning his genre. Well, I mean, whether or not he's obliged to engage with it is sort of one question, but uh, sort of as a historic, like as a sort of understanding of the process of how the novels were written, he definitely was engaging with the most up-to-date sort of discourses of the time, because prior to writing the novels, he was a crime writer. He was interviewing criminals, doing journalism, that kind of thing. When he was writing the novels, he used his contacts in the FBI to go and sit in on lectures at Quantico to sort of ride along, like have a guest position in looking in on investigations and stuff. Not as his selling point of being the real deal. I mean, right, okay, so my reading, so it starts off, and it starts off quite subtle, and it gets more sort of clear as the series progresses, but Harris's writing becomes sort of more and more critical of the institution as the series progresses. So in Red Dragon, it's there, but it's blink and you miss it. Like Will Graham being sort of a victim of the FBI, or a victim of his own masculinity as well. But it becomes clearer through Starling's arc, where the sort of villain, like Mason Verger, is bankrolling a bunch of FBI higher ups to run investigations the way that he wants them done. And so, like, being critical of the institutions that he is ostensibly an insider to is it is something that I think is in keeping with Harris's sort of takes on how the world works. His latest one, Kari Mora, is an interesting example too, because like in that one, the police, like there's a detective character who shows up, threatens the wrong person, and then is just completely ineffectual, and the protagonist has to solve all her own issues. And it's interesting, like that, you know, it's kind of like you know, on any given sort of understanding of the transgender thing, how critical could he be? Well, he wasn't working in the medical field. He wasn't sort of a medical journalist. But I think that there's always criticism in Harris's works about any institution claiming to be a authority on human experience or sort of morality or that sort of thing. So like, whilst he does present the idea of the day, the sort of accepted framework of how this is all supposed to work, there's also sort of questioning going on as it's being presented. And I think that happens in both the institutions of law enforcement and the medical institution to a lesser degree. Oh, thank you.
Any more questions? Do feel free. No one. I'm just gonna wait a sec. I feel like you all had so many opinions at the beginning. Where have the opinions gone? Hungry for a rewatch of the series now.
Yeah, and I mean, like, each adaptation has its own merits. Yeah, the brain eating scene in Hannibal is like peak of that film. I feel like it's that's just good cinema. Um, oh, I haven't read the novels at all, so this might be basic. Is there a basis for the stag motif from the TV series? There's a stag. No, but I think that it is an interesting and quite effective visual motif to translate Will Graham's declining mental state onto screen. One of the big difficulties in adaptation, obviously, is that in a novel, you can have anything. You can explain anything with words. But on the screen, it becomes difficult to portray the sort of interiority of characters, and having a motif like that where you can portray on the screen like Will Graham's mental state is represented by this stag, that's a really helpful sort of visual cue. And yeah, there is a scene described, like Will Graham has a monologue in the TV series about the utility and grotesquerie of his abilities to empathize with people. So he describes it as having like a desk made of antlers, where it's like it's a practical thing, but also it's rooted in sort of violence and horror. And that's sort of lifted directly from the novel. So there is like mention of antlers, but it's more of a metaphor than it is like a suggestion of an actual creature. But yeah, I think that the TV, like in a lot of ways, the TV show did an astoundingly good job of capturing the sort of atmosphere and mood of the books and translating that into a more modern sort of setting. Let's see. As a trans horror critic, this has been an interesting discussion. Yeah, great, thank you. What do you think of Hannibal as a queer-coded character in the books versus his sexuality in the show? I think the show was like the one adaptation where they weren't. Oh no, actually, okay. So yeah, I think the queer coding of Hannibal Lecter is pretty clear for me in the books. Like, I don't think that you could really argue that Hannibal's straight. I don't really think that. Yeah, I don't really think that it's like in question that Hannibal's a queer coded character in the books, and I think the TV show did a great job of like playing with that. The other adaptation that I think had an interesting sort of queer coding of Lecter, because I think like the Anthony Hopkins films are a little bit more straight than the other adaptations. But I think Manhunter with Brian Cox did a fantastic job of having this like interestingly suggestive Hannibal Lecter, where he's sort of, you know, on his phone in his cell with his feet up like a teenage girl talking to her crush, like, oh, hey, Will, like, here you're investigating murders again. Like, I think that was great. And I think it was like an interesting take on the character. And like, yeah, I think that the queerness is definitely there in the novels, and I think it's interesting how the different like the different screen adaptations choose to bring that through. Oh yeah, here's the quote. Someone's provided the quote. He viewed his own mentality as grotesque but useful, like a chair made of antlers. Yeah. Thinking about it. Thinking about it in relation. Sorry, Kara, I'm not sure what you mean by it in relation to masculinity. The stag king, which often features in fantasy, is a sacrificial figure, so weird for Hannibal. Well, Will's kind of the sacrificial character. Jack Crawford wants him to go back into the field every time, even though it's damaging him. And Will sort of has a token resistance and then goes, yeah, okay, Um, I'll go. I'll die for the cause. And it's a little bit, yeah, it is like a bit of a sacrificial sort of thing. I'm not sure specifically about that mythological figure. I'm not familiar with it, but where are we going? Sorry, there's just a lot of questions all of a sudden. Mm, mm, mm. I found Hannibal being a herbivore animal weird. I mean, the deer's a herbivore, but the crows will definitely eat meat, and the raven stag is a composite animal. So in a way, it's herbivore. Yeah, he eats his veggies, but he's also part crow, and the sort of like melding of different ideas in the sort of disruption of the natural order, I think, is a little bit of what's going on there. The stag creature, the man stag probably was more of like the thing that people are associating with Wendigos. I'm not conversant with indigenous mythology, so I can't really talk about it. Have no background there. Yeah, there's two sort of fantastical figures in the series. There's the Raven Stag and there's the Man Stag, which is a black, like a matte black cast of Hannibal, of Mads Mikkelsen as Hannibal with antlers, who haunts Will when he begins succumbing to Hannibal's will. So it's kind of there's this sort of two-pronged sort of visualization of one, Will succumbing to his mental illness, and two, Will succumbing to Hannibal's influences. Yeah.
Not to interrupt, but Tree, was it you that sent me that link the other day? Somebody sent me a link of the metamorphosis thing. Was that you? I don't know. It was you. Do you have the link just so that we can share it with people? Because I can't remember where I've got the link stored. I don't know if you want to say what it was. I can't really remember what it was in terms of like its relation to Hannibal. But like the imagery of like the stag and so on and so forth. Tree sent me this video the other day that seemed to be like quite linked in terms of at least the aesthetics and what was going on. And it's which is the Greek myth or whichever one it is where it gets turned into a stag and ripped apart. You know the one I mean?
Oh, yeah.
There you go. Yes. So it's
Action.
yeah. So it's a sort of interpretation of that, but like it's very, very, very similar in terms of the aesthetic strategies to what goes on in those early episodes of Hannibal with the stag stuff. Just as an interesting thing for people if they're interested in it. Yeah. I was very excited when Tree shared it with me. It was lovely. Well, by lovely, I mean gross. But great. There you go. There's the video. If anyone wants the link, it's in the chat. Does anyone have any more questions? I think we've had loads. That's great. Anyone else got any more? Or any thoughts, comments?
Oh, I'll just quickly go back to, I've just remembered something about, so someone was asking you about Hannibal's characterization in the show and his sort of sexuality and stuff. Maybe sort of adjacent to that, I read an analysis of the show that was like talking about Hannibal's arc as a Medea arc. So sort of because when Will's trying to leave him, he kills their child. And I thought it was interesting that there's the comparison of Hannibal Lecter, and he's sort of portrayed in a fairly feminine sort of way in the show, where he is sort of he's sort of looked down on by a lot of people, even though he's a professional, even though he's sort of upper class and fancy. and he has this sort of criticism of him coming in from a lot of directions, where it's like you're feminine, you're queer, you're all of this. Like there's the insurance salesman who's like, yeah, you've got to tell me if you've got HIV, buddy. Like, and it's kind of a little bit. It's interesting that that's how they went for it. Where I feel like the Anthony Hopkins sort of role takes it in a very sort of like, yeah, he's masculine and scary because he's kind of small but buff and all of this. But yeah, the sort of Hannibal as an effete like clothes horse who has a perfect house and kitchen and cooks sumptuous meals and yeah, and has like the most fabulous time management skills you've ever seen, is an interesting sort of characterization, which I think works really well with the novels as well. Yeah, and having Mads Mikkelsen in the role, who was a gymnast and dancer, yeah, that's like, I think that it's just a fabulous choice. Like he has such a great sort of subtlety of control of his body. Interesting that you talk about Will's masculinity in the books and movies, because in the show, I think he occupies a role usually given to a female character. Um, I mean, I find it difficult to think of how a woman, so there are often women in investigation procedurals who are put in a position of, having to choose between work and family, or having to choose between their own advancement or success on this case, or something like that. But most of those I feel like fit more into the Starling, into the Clarice Starling sort of model, where they have to be hyper competent, on top of their game. They're not allowed to have any weaknesses. They're not allowed to show any hesitation in the field, like all of that. Whereas Will, as a man, sort of has that social credit where he can be on the scene having a complete breakdown, and people will cover for him in that way. Like he kind of gets an out in his behavior because he's a useful tool. Empathy is traditionally a feminine coded trait. Yeah, like yeah, but yeah, like I think that Jonathan Harker is a sort of apt comparison. I think it's like it's okay because he's a man. If Clarice Starling went into the field and said and started sweating and shaking and having a breakdown but still got the answers, they'd be like, don't know about that. Don't think that's gonna fly, buddy. But Will Graham like keeps getting sought out because of his sort of ability to be manipulated into doing what people want them to do, and also because he's a man, they can excuse the stuff that goes wrong. Yeah. So it's interesting. It's sort of a blend of masculine and feminine traits, and it's like no one's strictly one or the other. Like that's just like sort of life. But where you've got whatever people are going to perceive you as, is how much slack they're going to give you, kind of thing. Whereas it's like everything else. It's a woman's thing until someone else is until someone is a master of it, like cooking. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like any woman, like Molly probably has, pretty decent empathetic ability. Molly's the one who actually ends up killing Francis Dolarhyde in the end of the book because Will Graham's busy being unconscious on the beach. But like no one's going to ask Molly like, do you think that the killer maybe had a bad childhood and that's why he's acting out? They'll go to Will and ask him. And I think it's really interesting how people frame the need for Will Graham as an appeal to his expertise or his specialty or his being unique in the field. But the only real unique thing that Will has is that he will go along with what he's told to do. So they they Jack Crawford has other people he can go to for advice. So like both in the book and the show, he sort of has has Alan or Alana Bloom there and says like, you know, oh, what do you think of this? But he has two options. So he says like, what do you think of this course of action? And Bloom says, that's a terrible idea. That's ethical. Don't do it. And then Jack Crawford's second opinion says, well, it could work. Like maybe it'll work. So I don't see why not. And Jack Crawford will always go with the opinion that does things the way he wants things done. And so Will makes an easy option for that, because you can get the correct answer in the way that you want it. And there's sort of, so in the novel, people will say like, oh, Will Graham, you're the guy who has the standard monograph on insect analysis, like on body decomposition by insect analysis. And even in the book, like there's this character, Brian Zeller comes up to him and says, oh, hey, I know you from your paper that you wrote. And Will says, yeah, that's right, I wrote that paper. And then sort of both of them are like, yeah, this other paper by this other person's better, but like, good on you for being the standard one. So there's kind of this sort of repeated thing of Will being sort of welcomed in as, oh, here's the best guy for the job. And then someone going like, well, this other person can do the exact same thing and with the same or better skill, but Jack Crawford wants Will there because he's the one that can be manipulated into doing things Jack's way. I've missed a few now. I felt personally that the Cox portrayal of Hannibal was more real, whereas Mads and Hopkins were too villain archetype, and that seemed too unreal. Too sore thumb standing out, whereas Cox was like a friendly, unassuming neighbor you wouldn't suspect is very intelligent and monstrous. I mean, I feel like, yeah, that's fair. I feel like for the Mads portrayal, and even for the Anthony Hopkins one, like in the scene in Red Dragon where they do like a flashback to before he was caught, I think that there is kind of it's a variable. It's your mileage may vary, sort of how much you think you would take of someone being a little bit weird before you'd go, that guy's a cannibal, you know. It's like one of those magic eye pictures where it's like you can't see anything until suddenly you just get the right angle, and then you're like, oh, that was there the whole time. But I think like you know, because we as an audience can see the artificiality of Hannibal's sort of people like person mask. I think it would feel like if we were in the position of someone in the text, it would be very much like, yeah, that guy who's like weirdly formal and a little bit, he dresses funny and he's a little bit odd, but you know, makes a great roast. Like, not gonna knock the guy. So I think like there is that kind of like, because like I feel like even when I was watching the TV series, I like I was sitting there going like, oh no, don't hurt poor Hannibal's feelings. He doesn't deserve that. And then sort of sitting back when the episode finished and going like, wait a second. I know where this is going. Like I'm not fooled, but I'm fooled by this sort of the immediacy of the human, like the humanity of the character coming through, which is an interesting sort of like, it was an interesting sensation watching the show, knowing what's going to happen, but still being kind of fooled into it. Mads explicitly said that he was basically playing Lucifer. Yeah, I thought that was an interesting sort of character analysis. I liked that he was like in love with beauty, and that he found everything beautiful rather than being like, yes, I'm going to be nasty and I'm going to kill people. It was like, I'm going to look at people in an alternative way where they are beautiful on the inside, literally. Like, I enjoyed that. Cox has the benefit of prefiguring Hannibal as a juggernaut cultural figure. Yeah, that's another thing, is that the original film adaptation of Red Dragon, Manhunter, was really like underappreciated. It kind of flew under the radar, and a lot of people think that Anthony Hopkins was the first person to play Hannibal Lecter, and it's like, oh, someone else did it first. Did they do it better or worse? Like, I'm not gonna judge, because I think one of the great things about this franchise is that like all of the adaptations have had really good performances, like decent script writing. Like they're not really like failures. Like, obviously they become so popular because they're well made. Um, and I think like it's an interesting thing for me, like sort of criticizing the adaptations on a sort of more like nitty gritty level, because it's like, well, okay, you got the characters and you got the broad sort of storyline, but you've made it mean something different, which is where my interest comes from. Um, uh, okay. The choice to have Hannibal Lecter make cannibalism puns at every possible opportunity extremely woke. Yeah, I thought that was great. I was chortling when I watched it. Uh, Yeah, I think that's a good point. So Vrye has said, I'd call the difference between Hannibal and Fuller mainly that Harris is selling cutting edge gritty thrillers and Fuller is making a deliberate gothic dream. I would argue that there is a lot of the gothic and purple in the novels. They are very much in the school of the Southern Gothic. There's a lot of family saga, sort of hidden secrets, and the language use is certainly um, much more sort of purple than I would expect in a strict thriller type. But yeah, there is kind of like Fuller has taken particular elements of the novel that he wants to work with and has done them like sort of really, really well on screen. Uh, Fuller's Hannibal is the ignore all the weird stuff because he's European, hypercultured, with the opera and the interior decorations and architectural and hyperrealism of his drawing. Yeah, yeah. Um, it is. I think it is. There is a lot of like, oh well, is he gay or European sort of thing going on. That's that's a big part of it, is that he's a foreigner. He's an immigrant, and he's one of those immigrants that is aspirational rather than someone to be sort of looked down on. Um, um, Nicholson's Hannibal also seems like he was situated in the notion of the artist, hence why we get the echoing serial killer who's a cellist. Um, yeah, I mean, Hannibal in the books is very like, obviously his big thing is drawing from memory these perfect sort of scenes of landscapes of cities that he's been to, and drawing Clarice as Jesus on the cross, so he can make a watch face with her on it. Doing the sort of Mickey Mouse hands with Jesus. Um, but yeah, like and in I think in Hannibal Rising, which is something that doesn't really get talked about much, probably for good reason. But in Hannibal Rising, Hannibal kind of has the youth of a starving artist. He's doing an anatomical drawing for a medical school whilst he's doing his medical sort of undergrad study, and also selling art to survive, sort of in Paris post-war. So it's interesting that the other adaptations don't really pick up on that as much, but that's something that Fuller did take from the novels, which is pretty cool. Um, so, developing characterization of Hannibal on screen as a polite Byronic killer who just has to get rid of uncivilized louts is not out of step with some representations of man killers on the American frontier 100 years earlier. Not sure what to make of that. Is some American representation of violence just kind of Byronic? I mean, I think that the whole like he only kills the rude thing is another kind of layer of irony, because he definitely does kill for fun as well. And he definitely, like, a big part of Hannibal's practice as a serial killer slash artist is not killing outright, but convincing other people that they should kill. So yeah, I mean, like, the sort of kill the rude thing is very much a part of Hannibal's self mytholization, I think. Mythology, yeah, making his self mythology. He does sort of espout that kill the rude as an ideology. But I think that a more honest sort of reading it would probably be kill the boring, because some people are more interesting when they're dead. The frontier examples were not realistic. Yeah, I'm not totally familiar with American history. Sorry, but if it's anything like Australian history, yeah, most of the colonizers probably were very Hannibal Lecter types, except not as self-aware. Boorish rather than boring. I mean, I think like if you could be rude to Hannibal and be entertaining at the same time, that'd be like, I don't think he would sort of like the interaction with Jame Gumb with Buffalo Bill prior to him prior to him committing the crimes for which he becomes known as a serial killer. At the time he meets Hannibal, he is serial killing. And Jame is interesting because he's kind of standoffish with Hannibal. We're not told exactly what he did when he met Hannibal, but Raspail describes him later as being just amazed that Hannibal wasn't scared of him, because he knew about what Jame and Raspail had been doing. So I think that the sort of I personally, like, I don't know, maybe you have different takes on it, but my personal interpretation is that it's more like boring rather than strictly rude, because Jame is not the most sort of civilized person, and he survived to kill more and more and more, which is sort of the goal for Hannibal, I think. So yeah, I mean, there's you can have your sort of alternate readings of how it works. Mm-hmm. It's also a matter of what constitutes rudeness too. Yeah, true. Yeah, because politeness and rudeness are social constructs that vary by social situation. Yeah.
I don't know if I'm allowed to interject something about Byronic anti-heroes. May I?
I'll go ahead.
So like I keep seeing people talk about him as a Byronic villain, and I don't think that I would use that term. I mean, if you've been to my classes, you know me. I'm a little bit precious about the use of the term Byronic. But if we're talking about like villain archetypes, he's much more connected to the sort of de Monthalts and the Count Foscos, the sybaritic kind of decadent villain that you also see obviously kind of coming out in Dorian Gray, but that's distinct from the development of the Byronic villain through the sort of the tortured criminal mind, which is not necessarily what we get in Hannibal. Just my thoughts there. I'm quite happy.
Yeah, I think the big difference between like, so I'm not a Gothic, like I'm not a Byronic scholar, but my sort of understanding is that the Byronic hero is kind of self-absorbed and is sort of self-pitying and is doing things that are sort of socially maybe a bit of a no-no, but because they're so hard, so conflicted and sort of broody, you forgive them because, well, he's just having a hard time. And I don't think that really tracks with Hannibal, because he's not self-pitying. He's not, even with like his sort of extensive history of trauma. Hannibal describes himself, like when he's describing himself, he describes himself as a sort of force of nature. So he says, like, Starling says something like, what happened to you to make you do the things you did? And he says, nothing happened to me, I happened. Now, this is, like, obviously, if you read the end of the Hannibal novel, if you read Hannibal Rising, like, yeah, he has an extensive history of trauma and sort of terrible experiences. He was a child during World War II. His family was killed in conflict, and he sort of had a lot of really traumatic experiences, and then as a young man decides to hunt down the Nazi sympathizers who killed his sister and eat them. And sort of, you would be really sort of, I think that if you said, oh, well, Hannibal's, if Hannibal was a self-pitying character, or like if he was sort of going like, oh, well, I was traumatized, that's why I do it, like that would be more along the Byronic path. But the way that Hannibal self-describes in the sort of text is that he had a choice, and he made the choice that would make him most happy, because he has the decision at the end of Hannibal Rising. Do I stop killing and go on the straight and narrow and get together with my hot aunt, or do I keep on hunting them Nazis? And it's like he chooses murder, because that's the thing that fulfills him. Right. So I think that, yeah, the matter of choice is quite important in the series. I think that because like sort of every character has trauma and has reason to do horrible things, but the difference is between the characters who choose to murder and the characters who choose not to murder. So I think it's yeah, cannibalizing Nazis is like honestly, up until probably he goes to America, he's pretty much on the straight and narrow. Like, I mean, he does kill a butcher, who was possibly a collaborator, with the Nazis, but not strictly speaking a Nazi in occupied France. So, but not one who had personally victimized Hannibal's own family, except for sort of catcalling his aunt. So that's, like, do we kill Nazis, kill misogynists? Yeah, sure. Kill them, steal their fish, bake their cheeks with moral mushrooms. That's fine.
I mean, just to clarify, if any sort of law enforcement agency is listening into our Zoom sessions, this is not the romancing the Gothic policy.
I'm not advocating cannibalism.
Oh gosh. Yeah.
Unless you're starving to death in the Lithuanian wilderness in the middle of the snowy, like, you can eat them then if you're going to die otherwise. But really, you don't know where they've been.
No, I don't think you want any sort of official policy on eating Nazis, Mason. But that's okay. So just to say to Alex, by the way, I wasn't attempting to have a go at your idea of the Byronic. I think it's just something I always enjoy interrogating, is like where that kind of Byronic legacy lies and where we diverge from the Byronic legacy. So don't take it. So I don't know if anyone else has if anyone else has any questions. with amazing foresight, I booked extra time for us tonight. But so yeah, if you have any questions or comments that you want to make, otherwise we can wrap up.
I'll just share my thread of my stories, I think, if I can find it.
Yeah, so Mason didn't have a Ko-fi or an Amazon wish list that he could share, but I mean, he does have PayPal, so if you want to support him, you can get in contact with him via the Twitter, and he's going to put a link of his books, like his creative work, that you can also have a look at. And if you are interested in knowing more about Mason's creative work, he did an author interview last week for us,
I did.
on the YouTube channel.
Yeah, so that's a link to my Twitter thread on my Twitter. It's got some of my fictional works. It's also got the link to the journal where this paper appeared at the start of the year. And yeah, follow me on Twitter, I guess, if you want more hot cannibalism takes. Because I talk about that way too much, like, honestly. It keeps coming up. So thank you all for coming and listening to this really long version of the short presentation. Yeah.
It was great. Thank you so much, and thank you to everybody that came along. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hopefully will see you all next week for some stuffs. Yeah, it was great discussion. I loved having so many people interact. I think that's been the best discussion we've had in any of the classes, so that was amazing. I loved it. Okay, so I will see everybody later. Thank you so much for coming, and goodbye.